Andrew is the program director at the Center for Self-Advocacy here in Buffalo and an adjunct professor of disability studies for the City University of New York, teaching courses for the online master's program. He's also a 2018 Open Buffalo Democracy Fellow, working to increase civic and community engagement among people with disabilities in Buffalo and Erie County so that our communities can become more inclusive, open, and accessible to all people. He received his PhD in American Studies at the University of New Mexico, which I'm a little bit biased about because I also went to UNM for one of my masters. His research explored the lived experiences of people with disabilities, the politics of the built environment, and the culture and political legacies of movements for disability rights and disability justice. So that's Andrew. Jerome is the upstate community organizer for Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement. He's working to educate, advocate, mobilize, and organize communities in Western and Central New York to ask for comprehensive reforms and the use of solitary confinement in New York State jails and prisons. He's also the executive director of the MAN program, a program that provides mentoring, tutoring, in-class workshops, court advocacy, and referrals for needed services and community supports. He's a survivor of solitary confinement and has worked as a preceptor, working as a guide, mentor, and role model for young men at Veritas High School and addressing in and out of school barriers and opportunities, helping them to achieve their goals. So that's Jerome. And Sam directs the Partnership for the Public Good and teaches at SUNY Law School and Cornell ILR. He's a graduate at Harvard University and UCLA School. He serves as the attorney for the City of Buffalo Living Wage Commission, as a member of the Niagara River Greenway Commission. His publications range from scholarly articles to comic books, including a nonfiction book, a novel, a movie, and a book of poetry. He hosts a radio show, The Public Good, every Tuesday on WUFO. So with that, if you want to kick us off.
All right, thank you, Kristen. So welcome again, everyone. Great to have you with us. Wonderful to see some new faces and some old friends here. So we're going to talk about public policy advocacy and how to do it. And I'm really delighted to have Jerome and Andrew here. So each year at PPG, one of the advocacy tools that we use is to create a community agenda. And our partners propose advocacy planks, and then they vote on them. And then the top 10 become the community agenda for that year. Jerome and Andrew each have planks that they proposed that made it onto our community agenda. And so what we're going to do today is, as we go through what public policy advocacy means and how you do it, I'm going to turn repeatedly to them to offer sort of real-life examples and insights that they've gained from doing the work. So they're going to, in a little while, they'll give you basically their campaign pitches. They're going to give you really short versions of what they're working on and why, so that you're grounded in their campaigns, and then we'll return to them time and time again as we talk about different individual tools. So before we get to how you do public policy advocacy, in other words, how do you get government to do something or not do something that you care about, the first thing we have to talk about is what public policy means and what tools government has to do what it is you want them to do. So let's take a moment. Let me ask you this. So you want government to change something, to make something better. What tools do governments have to do that? So what are the tools in their toolbox? So shout one out. What can a government do to change something in a community?
Pass a law.
They could pass a law. That's one of the most powerful tools that they have. In addition to laws, there are regulations. So usually the legislative branch passes a law, and then the executive branch often creates regulations to administer that law. So laws and regulations tell people, do this, don't do that, do it this way, don't do that way. Most fundamental tool government has. They've got a lot of other tools too. What are some other things government could do that would change something? Yeah.
Financial tools through credits or grants.
Yeah, so a whole range of financial tools. Government controls a lot of money, and they can use that in different ways. So one would be through the tax system. So if the government wants you to do less of something, they can put a tax on it. So when New York City decided it wanted people to smoke less, it put a huge tax on cigarettes, and people ended up smoking a lot less. So you can use taxes to disincentivize something. Or if there's something you like and you want people to do more, you can cut the taxes for that. So if you think that solar energy is a really good thing, you might cut taxes for people who install solar panels on their home or something like that. So taxes, tax incentives, but you also mentioned grants, loans. So the government also incentivizes or supports a lot of activity through direct financial aid. They can make loans, they can make grants. It's a really powerful tool. Okay, what else could government do that would change things one way or another? Any other ideas? How about kind of on the communications side? What are some of the tools government has to educate people or reach people or communicate with them?
We have a lot of information, so there's information about kind of the needs and ways to reach people.
Yeah, that's a great point. So government, among other things, it's the storehouse of vast amounts of data and information, and you can access that, or you can be asking them to use that information or those communication tools. So they run public education, so that's a really big way in which they influence people's behaviors and their ideas and their knowledge. They also have a lot of other tools. So if you're flipping through the channels to get to something you're more interested in, you sometimes run across government access channels. So they have TV. If you're listening to the radio, you might hear like your state senator with his own radio program. When government officials call press conferences, the press usually shows up. So they have a lot of access to the media. So government has a lot of communications tools that they can use to make something happen, make something not happen, change things. Another whole set of ways that government influences public policy is through essentially its own operations. So government employs a lot of people, they buy a lot of goods and services, and the way that they do those things can have a big influence on public policy. So let's use the environment as an example. If the government chooses to buy recycled paper instead of non-recycled paper, that has an environmental impact, and the government buys a lot of paper. So it has a big impact. There are different types of laws that have to do with the standards that government uses when it hires companies to do certain things. So, for example, here in the city of Buffalo, we have a living wage law that says if you make a contract with the city of Buffalo, then you need to pay your employees a certain wage that's higher than minimum wage. So the government's using its power to buy goods and services to influence wages. So if you're thinking about, we really need bigger wages, you might think pass a law that directly tells people how much to pay, like a minimum wage law. But you could also use this power of operations, of buying things, to get at that issue. So those are some of the tools that government has in its toolbox. So when you, as advocates, are going to government to change something, always remember that there are a lot of different tools at their disposal. That it might be about passing laws or regulations, but it might be about communicating something differently, or funding something, or not funding something, or changing the way it buys goods and services. All right, so that's public policy. Those are some of the tools. Now we're going to talk about the tools that we all have as advocates to change government policy. Now, this may shock you, but to change government policy, you usually need more than a good idea. What else do you need besides a good idea? Shout something out.
People, allies.
People, allies. Yeah, absolutely.
Donations.
What's that?
Campaign donations.
You need
lots of them.
money. Money is super helpful. You just said the two main things. People and money. Those are going to be the two main things that are going to influence behavior. And we're going to focus a lot more on the people side because if you're doing public policy advocacy and you're not working for a large business, you're not going to have a ton of money at your disposal. So one thing you need is you need a good story. You need a short, memorable way to describe your issue. So I'm going to turn to my co-presenters now and have them tell you about their issues. I'm actually going to ask Andrew to tell you about two different ones because he's working on two different issues that we're going to be drawing examples from. And Jerome, you just got one. So we'll do Andrew, Jerome, Andrew, how about? So Andrew, pick your issue and and make a pitch.
Okay, so many of you might not know that Western New York is currently served by an office for persons with developmental disabilities that is nearly 3 miles from the nearest public transit point. So people with disabilities, many of whom don't drive, have a hard time getting there. It's located at the site of a former state institution where people with disabilities were housed for decades. It was deliberately isolated from the community because at the time it was thought, we'll put people with disabilities away, out of sight, out of mind. Unfortunately, because state services are still located there, some of the people who used to live in that institution have to go there to receive services. And at that institution, there are job opportunities for people with disabilities that have been created by the state of New York specifically to inform state policy on disability. But those people who are hired to do that work can't actually get there. So what we're saying is that the state of New York and the governor of New York, who holds most of the power over OPWDD, need to move those services into an accessible location in the community that's accessible by public transit and is centrally located so that the vast majority of people who access those services can actually get to them.
All right, now you have something to aspire to, okay? So you want to practice so that if you need to describe your issue someday, you can do it that succinctly and eloquently. And just to give you an example of why it's so handy to have your stump speech ready, when we were working a lot on waterfront issues, canal side in particular, and trying to get canal side so that it delivered more benefits to the community than the original plan for it, which involved giving the Bass Pro store $75 million to put a big Bass Pro down there. When we were doing that, Congressman Higgins was an important voice because he's very influential on the waterfront. And I found myself standing behind him at Spot Coffee. So I had 2 minutes, and I could have given a great speech like that while we waited in line, and I had nothing. I had absolutely nothing. I was so not ready, and the opportunity went by. So you don't want to be like me. You want to be like Andrew. All right, Jerome.
What I'm about to tell you is absolutely true. And I know it's true, not because somebody told me or because I heard it or saw it someplace else. I'm telling this because I lived it. I am a survivor of solitary confinement, a torturous, arcane, and draconian way that we still in the state of New York, in opposition to international rules, house our people in prison. A solitary confinement consists of living in a cell about the cell of a parking space or a small bathroom with only a bed, a toilet, and a sink for 22 to 24 hours out of a day, with no meaningful human contact, no education, no therapy, no treatment, nothing. You alone, left to your own devices. However, what's even worse about this is that they claim that this is for public safety. So I ask you, if you were locked in a room for days, months, weeks, years at a time, for 23 to 24 hours out of the day, and then were let out, do you think you would be a threat to public safety? I submit that you would be. Routinely in the state of New York, we do that every day. We let men, women, and children directly out from solitary confinement, no matter how long they've been there, and have not had anything addressing their issues. That same person will live next to you, work around you, be in your community, may even enter your home. That is not public safety. The United States signed on to a treaty, the UN General Assembly Treaty, affectionately known as the Mandela Rules, which restricts solitary confinement to no more than 15 consecutive days, because in their understanding and the world over, they believe that more than 15 days of solitary confinement is considered torture. Yet in New York State, we still hand out sentences to men, women, and children, pregnant women, nursing mothers, children 16 and under, anybody, and not, you don't have to go or have done anything to be in that situation. You can be pulled over and sent to the county jail and later exonerated and spend the entirety of your time in solitary confinement. We know that most of the suicides, most of the deaths in any correctional facility come while people are on solitary confinement. You're supposed to go there to be rehabilitated. However, you go there to lose your life. We need to stop torturing New York State now.
Now you got another example. And to give you just one little example of the power of a stump speech like that. So when we do this community agenda process, our partners who are proposing planks have 2 minutes to convince the other partners that they should vote for it. This year, after Jerome spoke and we voted, the partners ranked solitary confinement their number one issue. And I can tell you absolutely that that vote was heavily influenced by the eloquence of the speech. Most of the people walking in that room knew very little about solitary confinement before 2 minutes of that speech, and they were moved and they understood, and it became a very high priority for them where before it might not have been. So I saw it firsthand. Okay, Andrew, transit.
About a third, or maybe a little more than a third, of the people who live in Buffalo and the surrounding areas are transit dependent. That means they do not have a car, they depend on public transit. 90% of those are bus riders. And this includes older people, communities of color, poor and working people in the urban core. It includes people with disabilities. Transportation is a major issue for people with disabilities. And it includes younger people, especially high school students. Despite this need that's very prevalent in our community, most of our transportation dollars get invested in big flashy projects, in developing an airport that you can't get to by bus, or in highway systems, in car-based transportation systems. Part of the reason why all the money goes to people who drive cars, own cars, suburban commuters, is because powerful interests are at the heart of our transportation system. And this includes highway builders and rail contractors and suburban voters who get an outsized voice in our electoral process. So part of what Buffalo Transit Riders United is trying to do here in our region is to amplify the voice of people who depend on the bus, so that we can stop these cuts that have been happening to our bus since 2010, where year after year we're getting less service, fewer buses, and we can hold the NFTA accountable by having commissioners on the NFTA board who are actual riders, who actually depend on the bus. Because right now, all the decisions get made by people who don't use the bus. And some of them are powerful business interests in the medical and educational fields, in the transportation and trucking industry, in other areas where they have a voice in the system that they don't actually use. And we think that needs to change. And we know from national trends that the public input structures that transit agencies across the country set up to get public input are totally inadequate. And that's certainly true here in Buffalo, where the advisory committees don't have a vote on the commission. The only rider on our commission doesn't have a vote. She has to leave the room when major decisions are made. So riders need a vote, and that's what we're championing.
All right, awesome, thank you. So now you have a grounding in their issues that we'll be returning to, as well as examples of how to tell a story. So when you think about how to tell a story, as an advocate, one thing I encourage you to do is have a very clear version of who needs to do what, why. And I came up with a formula for this. It's a very complicated mathematical formula. X should do Y because Z. So whatever your issue is, you need to be able to boil it down to that. And you'll be surprised when you start looking at people doing advocacy how often one of those elements is missing. So you have to be really clear about who the actor is who has the power to change your issue. And you have to be really clear about what it is that they do. And a lot of times you'll find advocates just describe the problem and don't actually list succinctly the solution. And then, of course, the why. Why should that happen? So you need a short version that you can say like that. Then you also need the stories that people will remember. So for someone to act on your issue, they need to remember what it is and why. And the way that people remember things is through stories. So you're going to need stories that illustrate it. Memorable stories that engage people's hearts as well as their brains. So that's one thing you need to do public policy advocacy. Another thing you need is high quality information that supports your position. And Kristen showed you on our website, we have all kinds of information for you, and we also have places to get more information. When you go to our actions section, you'll find a lot of places to go to get more information about your issue. And I want to turn to Jerome and Andrew and ask you, when you started looking for information, Jerome, what were some of the sources, or what's an example of a source that you turned to get more quality information about your issue of solitary confinement?
Based on whatever your issue is, you have to go to the source that probably lords over that. So we went to a lot of criminal justice resources, Bureau of Justice Statistics, all the places that would give us the numerical numbers that we needed to justify part of our argument that too many people were someplace that they weren't. But we always went to multiple sources because whoever writing something is going to tell it from where they're writing it from. So this guy's writing from this side, and this woman's writing from that side. So the old adage that there's three sides to every story. It's her side, it's his side, and then somewhere in the middle is the truth. And it's important that you get as many sources as you can, so that you can discern what the truth of it really is. So multiple sources always. Do your own research. I mean, don't rely on just people who say they're experts giving you facts, because sometimes they're co-opted, as we see now in this political environment, that they have alternative facts and they got fake facts, and so you need to be able to talk confidently about the research that you're talking about by doing some research of your own and doing it from both sides. I would make an analogy with CNN and Fox News. They got somebody said, I will never watch Fox because they're talking only right. And other people, I'll never watch CNN. But if you don't watch both of them, then you really don't have a well-rounded view of what the angles are that you can approach and where you can get into, get the information that you need.
And to do, as you're preparing your advocacy, you always need to know what arguments you're going to run into opposing you. Mm-hmm. And so doing that well-rounded research, among other things, is going to help you find out the arguments against you, so you're ready to prepare.
And you also find out how much lack of information is out there that you may have to get yourself. And any information you can get yourself is always better, because if you've gotten it, you own it, you know what it is, it's indisputable to you, rather than you haven't relied on somebody else in any case.
And sometimes the story, you were telling me this earlier, that sometimes what you learn is that there is no information on your topic, and that itself is a story, because there's typically a reason why there's not information, and you need to dig deeper into that. Speaking of digging deeper, Andrew, sometimes the information is not that readily accessible.
Yeah, so when we started to advocate to move the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, we heard through the grapevine that there was a feasibility study done on the feasibility of actually moving the entire office to Buffalo. But after months of advocating with people at the office to get that study, we decided to file a Freedom of Information request. And we finally got a hold of the study, which was done in 2015. And it had a lot of useful information. For one thing, it revealed that it was an architecture's report. And it revealed that parts of the campus were not compliant with the ADA, not compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it was not accessible. The report also indicated that if the OPWDD was to relocate, it needed to improve its accessibility, but it also needed to be on a public transit route, and it needed to be centrally located in a community where most of the people could have access to it, which were 2 points that we had already been making for years before we even got this report. So it was really useful for us to have that report and be able to say, look, the state has done this research, and the state says, A, the current office is not ADA accessible in its entirety, and B, we could really benefit from relocating it. And then the second example I would give from the Be True campaign, under federal law, every metropolitan region has to have a regional transportation council. And so one of the things we did was we got the Regional Transportation Council 2050 plan for how they're going to spend money for the next 30 years. Now that was totally publicly available. They were giving it out to anybody who would take it. It's on their website, and it's their narrative. It's the vision that there's a lot of lip service paid to moving forward and innovation, but there's also really useful federal data in the report that works for our campaign. For example, there's data that documents that almost a third or more than a third of people who live in this area are transit dependent. There's data that documents that the demand for bus services and transit is actually going up, even though ridership goes down because buses are being cut. And that information is very useful. So the point is that sometimes when you get information, you have to read between the lines. You have to be able to analyze the information in the context of your own campaign, and you have to be able to kind of use those data points that are going to work for you for what you're trying to communicate.
Great. So there's a lot of information that you can get just by asking. And when it comes to government agencies, we always just ask first, can we have this data? But you do need to be ready for the fact that sometimes they'll say no, or they'll delay so long in responding that you need to use a legal tool, the Freedom of Information Law, which is not perfect, but very often very helpful.
Yes.
Very often when and you can find more information on our website about how to do a Freedom of Information Law request. It's quite easy, and often that will make the difference between not getting an answer and getting an answer. So you need that.
I was just going to say, if you're doing a Freedom of Information request, it's a really good idea to follow the template. That's really simple, and don't try to just ask for the fact. Don't try to make your case in your request, because they're getting so many hundreds of requests. They just need to know what you need and be as clear cut and as simple as possible. Because if you're trying to persuade somebody to give you information, that could backfire. What you want to do is make sure that you have as much information about the documents that you need as possible, including the specific documents, the dates, the department, just as much information as you can about the document, because that's just going to increase your chances of getting what you need.
Perfect. So there's the information about your issue. Then there's a whole other kind of information that you need to gather as you start doing advocacy, and that's your power analysis. So that's finding out who wields power over your issue, both inside and outside of government. And unless you do that, your advocacy is not going to be very well directed, because you're not going to be going to the people that actually control your issue. So, Jerome, when you started doing solitary confinement advocacy, tell us about one key person you found in a position of power.
For my issue of solitary confinement, somebody would have to be somebody involved with criminal justice, and we weren't sure who on the legislature, the Senate, the state was involved, and found out that Senator Patrick Gallivan, who is, in this area, who has his reaches, the way they lined it up makes him senator for a lot of this area, was actually the chairman of the corrections committee. So the committee that our bill had to come out of in order to get voted on, he was the chairperson. So I was able to find that out and then develop a relationship with him, where we sat down and we talked on a number of occasions about how to get my bill pushed forward and what he would do or could do to help advance that cause.
We'll return to Senator Gallivan a little later when we talk about working with elected officials. But the power analysis was critical because you found out that this person chaired the committee, the most relevant committee. Sometimes your power analysis is about people in government. Sometimes it's about allies. who can help you move your issue, who have a certain other kind of power. Andrew, if you could give us an example of that.
Sure. So when we first started the campaign to move the Office for Persons with Disabilities, we did a kind of government power analysis, and we tried to figure out who in government is actually in charge of this building. And it became really cloudy and really difficult because there were so many different agencies involved: the Dormitory Authority, the Department of Health, the Department of Mental Health, OPWDD, all these different offices. So we became pretty frustrated. But then one of the things we learned and realized was we did an allies analysis, and we found out that on our committee was a leader who had helped found the Developmental Disabilities Alliance of Western New York Family Committee. And this happened to be a really influential lobbying group made up of industry officials. By industry, I mean people who take care of people with disabilities, and parents, and a lot of people who had a lot of pull in Albany around disability issues because they had been advocating for the better part of 40 years. And they usually take a pretty conservative stance on things. But because we had members of our task force who had a lot of credibility and trust with them, we were able to convince them on this issue. And so when they had their powwow, their powerful legislative breakfast, which they do every December, they invited us to speak on the issue. They opened a lot of doors in terms of meeting with different elected officials. They got the issue on the agenda of people across the state who are working on issues around disability. So that turned out to be a really big thing, even though we weren't able to clearly identify, other than the governor himself, who seems to have most of the power over OPWDD. It was kind of hard to chart the flow, partly because they've had like 5 different OPWDD commissioners in the last six or 7 years.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of turmoil going on between OPWDD and the Department of Health, and there's kind of a merger thing going on. But anyway, so yeah.
So your power analysis is not just people in elected office, but also potential allies and potential opponents, outside of government.
I feel like I need to say this because you guys don't know what PPG has meant as being an ally, especially to my campaign, that allowing us to come in and then do our presentation and then get the votes. We were able to get our campaign out to people who 99.9% would not have been hearing about it, would not have been coming to the community events that we host. And having PPG with so many partners and people in such disparate jobs and careers and businesses was a boon to us getting Western New York on the map as far as the campaign was concerned. So they didn't pay me to say that. As a matter of fact, they didn't pay me for anything, but that's another story. But I mean, I really think that sometimes we don't praise the allies that we have who do the best for us because we're always looking for other allies. And I think it's a poor toad who don't take care of the pad that he's got. And I really think that PPG has been a lifeblood for so many campaigns, so many advocates, because of the position that they have in this community and the amount of support that they have, that they quickly bestow upon everybody who gets involved. So I just think that needed to be said off to
So one tool you can do as you do your power analysis is a simple kind of chart that you can make. And on one axis, you're doing how powerful the person or the group is. And so higher up usually is more powerful, lower down is less powerful. And on the other axis, you're doing how much do you think they support your issue, from a lot to dead set against it. And that will help you do a group analysis of the people and the groups in power. And you're looking for people who are kind of in the middle, are often going to be the most important. People who have a fair amount of power but still haven't committed one way or another. But seeing it all in one place it's a very helpful tool. So I recommend making that actual power map or power chart as you do your power analysis. All right, so we're going to dive into the 3 main types of tool that you have. So we're going to talk about building your base, your community relationships, gathering your allies and supporters, and how you go about that. Then we're going to talk about actually working with government, elected officials, and staff. And then we're going to talk about telling your story, media, communications, techniques. And those are really the three pillars of doing public policy advocacy. Your community relationships, your relationships with government, and your storytelling, your communications. So we'll go through each of those. Before we do that, do you have any questions about what you've heard so far? Yeah.
I guess what I'm a little confused over is, let's take Jerome as an example. Your story, extremely compelling. You could make the argument that this would save the community money, it would be more socially just, so on and so forth. In other words, everybody would agree with you.
No, unfortunately, I wish that were the case.
Every reasonable person would agree with you. But yet, there is so much money in, like there's private prisons and those people contribute. I mean, are you just banging your head against the wall if you go to somebody with a compelling story, but they're getting a donation from, so should you do that before you do anything?
Yeah.
Like, look at who their campaign contributions are from.
Yeah.
Don't waste your breath.
So that's a great question. I'll take one stab at it and feel free to chime in. So one thing is, yes, do that analysis first. So as part of your power analysis, that's the kind of question that you want to dig into. So, you know, first you're just sort of arranging people and sharing what you know about how powerful they are and how much they might favor or not favor your issue. But then you're going to the next level and you're saying, okay, so who influences them? So I've identified that Senator Gallivan is critical to the issue of solitary confinement. Then I would look at, who donates to his campaigns, who are his allies both in and outside of government, so that you understand kind of the next level of the power analysis. We're going to talk more about this, but I would say even people you think are very unlikely, you want to have at least some contact with. But we'll get more into kind of making that decision. Did you you want to?
Yeah, I would say I've unfortunately I've run into what you're talking about. You would think that everybody would be for this, and then there are people who say, you know what, I'm for this, but I can't vote because it's political expediency sometimes. If I vote for this, it seems like I'm soft on crime. Or if I vote for this, I'm in this constituency area where the prison is located and all my money for my campaign, all my campaign workers are here. So, and then as an advocate, you got to understand the position that they're in. And your goal maybe not so much to change their mind as to get them to understand that this is bigger than politics. And if you can take...
I guess that's my question.
Yes.
Is anything bigger than politics? I know, that's how cynical I am.
Is anything bigger than politics?
Yeah.
Not really. No, but you got to say that. I mean, you got to make them believe that, because politics is life. Do you know, for a second, you know, we think of politics as bad because of bad politicians. But politics is really about the distribution of goods and services. Who gets what? You got politics in your home, you got politics in church, in school, in relationships. So politics is a way of life. And when we learn to play it better, then we realize that it's about everything, but we don't have to play politics. Let's take it out. It's a personal issue for some people. You try to make it personal. We said the story, when you personalize it, sometimes people can, you know, I don't agree with this politically, but I don't want to see anybody tortured. You know what I'm saying?
I think the rest of our evening will hopefully answer your question in a way. You know, money is incredibly powerful, but we're hopefully giving you the tools that enable you to sometimes win even against money. Building your community, because that means votes. Working directly with the electeds, because sometimes they are persuadable, and sometimes you're able to show them that they might not have fully recognized their own self-interest, that there might be more votes or allies that they're going to win with you than against you. And then working with the press and communications, because all elected officials are very press sensitive. And at the end of the day, they do need votes, not just campaign donations. And you do have an influence on whether they're going to get votes through the tools that we're going to talk about.
And I would just add really quickly, like one of the things that we ran into with the OPWDD campaign was that we learned that there were unions and worker interests at stake at the West Seneca facility. So there were people who had jobs there that were we knew were opposed to what we were doing, or we found out they were opposed. We learned that the state of New York, after the terrible shooting in San Bernardino, California, the state of New York had invested a huge amount of money in hiring people to do security at that isolated facility. And so there was this big investment in those jobs. So what we had to do was start building relationships with those unions. And we found that there were a lot of people that were part of those unions, including people with disabilities who couldn't get access to the location. But also there were people who were concerned about the safety issues at the facility. There you have asbestos, you have broken down elevators, you had it was hard to get to, and those people that worked there had a lot of the people had those concerns. So you try to build relationships, even if sometimes the union leadership may say one thing, but then the rank and file have a different view of it because they may be working in the building. So you just have to find ways to build relationships, even when you think they might be working against you.
So all three things we're going to talk about, your base building, your elected officials, and your media, the common theme will be building relationships. And when you think about building supporters, so we'll start with sort of base building. Think about it not just in terms of supporters, but think about it in terms of relationships. So you're trying to build this base. You're trying to have this long list of people who support your campaign. But think about each of those people as a relationship that you have with them, not just as sort of a name, and it'll work a lot better. Because if you actually want to motivate them to do something, they will usually only do it if they have a sense of relationship with you. And that means mutually beneficial. So a huge part of community organizing is working with people to identify the mutually beneficial part of the relationship. So if you just want people to do stuff for you, you just don't get that far. That's not how life works. And usually, ideally, you're trying to build a relationship for the long term in all these areas that we're talking about, whether it's electeds or medias or your base. And so you're trying to develop this sense that you're in it for the long haul, they're in it for the long haul, and you're going to be in relationship with each other. You're going to help each other in some way. So that's kind of the overall theme. And then there are different tools. But one thing with kind of all the tools is sort of being very intentional about building that base. So when you meet people through your work, you always are trying to harvest their contact information so you can follow up with them. And Jerome, I know you've learned some lessons about sort of follow up in that relationship building.
Yeah, one of the biggest banes to any campaign is keeping the momentum going and keeping people who initially come to an event and they're fired up and they're ready to storm the gates, and then they hear from nobody. And then they get interested in something else, or life hits them and they forget. Follow-up has been the biggest problem in advancing causes, and it's important that you have people on your team whose sole responsibility is to continue building up that relationship, follow-up. So if you hold an event and they sign up, within a couple of days, somebody should be reaching out to them saying, hey, you signed up, are you interested? And you should have events and things that they can be, because once a person they're interested and then they get involved, they take ownership of it, then you have somebody who you don't have to cajole and wrestle with to be involved, because now they're involved on their own level. And follow up is the first step to that. The minute you don't follow up, and we've seen it where, we have 500 people show up for one thing, and then a month later you got less than 100 because nobody contacted. They thought, it's too many people to contact. But now you don't have nobody here, so you cut off your nose to spite your face, so to speak. So you should always really concentrate on follow-up. If you have no follow-up, then you really have no advocacy, because you need people who are going to ride this out with you like you said, for the long haul. And people don't ride out the long haul if they don't feel like they're an integral part or they're needed or wanted in your campaign. And if you only call me, if you only come to church on Christmas, you're not a Christian. So it's the same thing with advocacy. If you only come out for certain things, then are they really with you when you need them? Because those certain things may be the things they like to come out to, but not the things that are more poignant for getting your message across or getting your advocacy pushed to the next level.
So there are a couple lessons in there that one of them's not so obvious. So one of them is that you often need to ask people to do stuff for you to get them invested. So sometimes you're afraid to ask people to give money or time because you're worried you're going to put them off. But in fact, they're not going to feel ownership of your issue unless they invest in that way. So Push Buffalo, one of our most successful community organizing groups, you pay to be a member. You pay a really small amount, but you pay because they want you invested. And you'll find a lot of organizing works on that model. It might not be money, it might be time, but you're asking them to do something. But then you're following up and continuing to communicate with them so they know they're appreciated and they know they are part of it and they are having an influence. Otherwise, just like any other relationship, when you don't hear from someone, you drift away. So that's kind of the attitude, and that follow-up is a lot of the work. But you also need some ways to get people together and to get them in the room with you and to learn your issue. And so let's talk a little bit about that. Andrew, from the West Seneca campaign, some examples of sort of getting people involved and successful events.
Sure. So this has been an issue for a long time, and back in 2013, even before I came to Buffalo, people were organizing around it because the bus service to West Seneca had been cut off. And the first time that people in the disability community marched from the bus stop to the institution was in 2013. They had 50 people, almost all of them from the disability community. And then this year in July, when we did the march, we had over 200 people participating, including several local legislators. And the healthcare workers union joined in, and we had Voice Buffalo, which is a coalition of over 55, I think, different churches and organizations. So we were able to build a much larger base of people by spending a lot of time meeting people, reaching out to people, doing one-on-ones with people, telling them our story, and using every opportunity we could to tell to any audience that we could find, whether it's tabling at the Disability Pride Parade or coming to events like these. I was at a PPG training one time, and I think it was Monica Wallace or her staff member, possibly, or maybe both of them were here. But they heard me give a pitch. They had never heard about this issue before. And the next thing you know, they're reaching out to the task force to see how they can support the issue. Legislator Wallace wrote a personal letter of support and basically got on board with our campaign just because we happened to connect that day. So every opportunity that you have to speak to people, you never know who's going to be in the audience.
Great. Sometimes it helps with your events to have something that's a little dramatic, that is attention grabbing. Jerome has a powerful example of that.
Yes, I don't know if any of you guys seen it, and it's going to be coming to an area near you soon, so just wait, don't worry about it. We had a replica solitary confinement cell built to form to, and since I've been there, I could tell you each nook and cranny. So we built it life-size, real model, and we take it around and we hold events with the cell where people get the opportunity to go in and hear the sounds. I have a soundtrack here that before we leave I just would put on for you guys so you can hear what goes on. But we play soundtrack, they get to go in the cell, and it's more educational outreach because you would think that people know about a lot of the issues that if it affects you, somebody else should know about it, right? But you don't know how many people don't really know about or know the intricacies of an issue. They just know what the fluff they hear on the news or what somebody said to them that they heard from 10 other people that's no longer the same thing. So you give an opportunity to get your issue out by doing something educational, to explain it, to let them know what's going on. So we hold these events and try to hold press conferences next to them so the wider community can get out there. And you hold them everywhere because you never know where your allies come from. And using what Andrew was talking about and what Sam's talking about, you never know where your allies come from is, the person who came up with the brainchild to build the cell was not me, who's been in one and should, because I never wanted to see one again. That's probably why I didn't think about it. But it was a police officer. Patrick Cray, one of Buffalo's finest, went to a showing of something like it and found out that as a police officer, he arrests people who he thinks is doing wrong and, puts them away to get help. But he did not know that they could end up in that. And it was such a bad taste in his mouth that he decided he wanted to campaign against it. And the first thing he thought about was, well, let's build it so I can show people what changed his heart. What changed his heart was seeing a cell and saying, I'm sending people there to lose their life and lose their mind, and I don't want to do that. So you would think a police officer wouldn't care or would be like, yeah, lock him up and throw away the key. But he was somebody who was the brainchild of this, and now goes around with us doing speaking engagements and carrying this cell, which is a monstrosity to
Wow.
begin with. Yes.
So, and having an unlikely ally is sort of a story in itself.
Yeah.
Now being able to say you've got a police officer on board is a big deal. So if you're trying to think about getting people to an event so that you can educate them, so you can bring them into your campaign. So we talked about one key is that personal relationship. I mean, so picture yourself. You hear that there's an event about solitary confinement or about moving the office for people with developmental disabilities at 7 p.m. On a weeknight. Are you going to go? What's going to get you there? It would take a lot to get you there, wouldn't it? There's so many other things you could do with your evening. So what's going to get you there? Maybe there's something very attention-grabbing and intriguing like a replica cell. Most likely there's something like that, and or it's personal relationships. Someone who you care about to some degree asks you to go, and so you go. So the relationship building is going to be key to get people there. And then there's some practical stuff. So you need a good venue. So one thing you can find on our website is we've created a venue directory for community events and nonprofits, so that you don't have to go through the work of brainstorming every single time you have an event of what would be the right place for it. We've got a list for you. You're going to be thinking about good public transit access to that event. You're going to be thinking about parking. You're thinking about the sound system at that place, those practical details. And then you're thinking about what else would make people want to come. Food and drink. If you can offer food and drink, it makes a really big difference. And then how are you going to get people there? One key is you need multiple ways to reach out into the community. So multiple co-sponsors is usually going to help. What other organizations have lists of people, have engaged people who might come to your thing? Will they help sponsor it? Just being your own little organization and putting up flyers, I mean, picture yourself walking by that flyer. You're not going to go. You have to somehow be invested, so you want groups of people. And maybe your event really shouldn't be a freestanding event. A lot of times people create these freestanding events around topics that just aren't going to draw people. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean you can't find people. It means you need to find people where they're already gathered for another reason. So captive audiences are a key part of your strategy. So are they there for a neighborhood meeting? Are they there for faith worship? Are they there at a class that you can visit and bring your issue to them? That's going to be very helpful. All right, let's move on to public officials. So that's a little bit about base building. Well, let me pause. Questions about base building before we go on to elected officials? Yeah, Ed.
Not so much a question, Sam, but just to that last point you made about going where the people are. I remember 10 years ago when we were in the height of the foreclosure crisis and trying to educate folks on the necessity of asking for help when you are seeing like you're running into trouble and trying to have these big events to get people to come to you and say, hey, I'm behind on my mortgage.
Yeah.
That doesn't work.
Right.
You have to go out to where they are and that sort of thing. So that's a great point to bring up.
Yeah, and go ahead.
How do you now potentially, by I understand reaching out to everyone you can to have as big of a base as possible, but it almost seems impossible to ascertain the histories of all the groups you might be aligning with. And while you might see bodies over here, that group of bodies could be in direct opposition with a power broker that you need to navigate. How do you
navigate that? That's a great question. So that's why when you do your power analysis, you're thinking about allies too. And you're getting your whole group together, because a lot of times people have different little bits of information. So you're identifying groups, and then you're sharing information about how likely they are to be with you, and then that'll help determine your priorities. And there are a lot of sources you can go to too. You're not in this alone. So one key to organizing is look for people who are already organized. So look for groups, not just individuals. And our partner list is one place to start. And then when you're looking through our partner list and you're saying, I don't know that group at all, call us and ask us and we'll tell you. So there's sources of information out there that can help you do that analysis.
And I think the other thing is having a broad base, so you have a cross-section of everybody. So there may be somebody on there that this guy doesn't particularly feel, but you got 3 other agencies on there that he's a board member or has family and friends. So they can kind of balance themselves out if you have enough of a multiple sponsorship.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you'll be surprised, like people that you wouldn't think would be allies, like Jerome was talking about earlier, turn out to be allies. True. Like the police officer, or like Pat Gallivan, who used to be a police officer, became allied with Reverend Wright's campaign. And then sometimes people that you expect to be allies, you realize they're not going to be champions for your issue, and so you don't want to spend a whole lot of time and energy trying to persuade them. You need to know who your champions are, who's going to be your champion, who are going to be your champions, and focus on those. So I think part of your question is, if there's this huge group of people, how do I narrow it down? And it's no simple answer, but you just have to be open to surprises, be open to making allyships where you might not think they would be, and also be open to recognizing when somebody's not going to be your champion, so you don't waste limited time and energy trying to get bodies, as you say, or people that aren't going to help you out, or people that might work against you.
All right, great. So let's talk about building your relationship with public officials. So let's start with the classic lobby visit. So you want to go see a city council member and talk about your issue. What do you want to research before you go see that person? What would you like to know about him or her before you? Yeah.
The voting record?
Voting record would be a great thing to know. So you know, how do they stand on issues like yours or your exact issue? What else might you want to know about them? Yeah, keep going.
Donors?
Donors would be a great thing to look at, and part of your kind of power analysis. Anything else you want to know?
Sometimes their career background can be important.
Yeah, really helpful. I was with a fellow advocate who started our meeting with a lawyer joke, not realizing the city council member actually was a lawyer. He really did not enjoy the joke. Neither did I. I was a lawyer too. She should have researched me. So their professional background can be very helpful. Their committee roles, their assignments, you want to look and see, okay, which committee are they on?
Educational background.
Educational background.
Because somebody went to your alma mater, and for no other reason that you went to the same school, willing to side with you or at least give you the time of day.
Yeah, absolutely. Who are their allies inside government? Who are their allies outside government? Who should you bring with you? So who would be helpful to have at a meeting with an elected? Constituents. So who could actually vote for them? They're going to care the most about people who actually vote for them. So if you come in and you're just sort of the outside expert advocate, they care a lot less than if someone from their district comes. You know they're going to give that person a respectful hearing, because that person, it's not just that they have votes, but they have family, they have friends, they have neighbors. So bringing constituents is super helpful. Before you go, make sure that the elected official knows who exactly you're bringing. And if you change it, let them know. They really care about that and appreciate that. And before you go, practice. So if you're bringing a group, make sure that everyone knows exactly what their role is. Don't just sort of bring a group and have a flowing conversation. Have a practice session where everyone has their assigned role and they know exactly what they're doing, and who's doing what, and that you're not repeating things from one person to another. And don't do what we often do in this business, which is have the prep meeting 20 minutes before the actual meeting with the elected. We always do that. That's such a bad way to do it. Do it the week before, and get it really figured out. Make sure that you have concrete goals. So what are you going to ask them for before you leave that meeting? And don't just have it be that they'll support you. Be more concrete. So are they going to sponsor your bill? Are they going to do a press conference with you so that the whole world knows that they support it? Would they agree to work on their fellow council members and try and get you more allies? Will they use some of these other tools that they have at their disposal? Will they have you on their cable access show? Mm-hmm. Will they put your issue in their newsletter? Will they take you to their block club meetings that they go to every month? There are a lot of different things you could ask for beyond just, will you support us? So go through your mental checklist of what those things are and what would be reasonable to ask for, and then ask for it. And try and get as many commitments as you can before you leave the meeting.
Well, can I add one thing? One thing that we say in our campaign is, whenever you meet with one of them, ask can you get a picture with them to show that you were there, and if you got them to support, that you can include it in your literature and other speaking engagements where you can say, yeah, that's me and the mayor there, and we was holding hands that day we were talking about our issue. So it's good to ask them, can I take a picture with you, but with the understanding that I'm going to use this in the future, let you know, people know that we're allied on this issue or something like that.
Remember, you're not just building relationships with the elected official, but also with their staff. Mm-hmm. The staff are often more important than the elected official herself or himself. And Jerome has a very good example of the importance of staff. So
we do lobby days, sometimes 3 times a year, and we go to Albany en masse, and we bombard the LOB with information, and we go to individual legislators, and we have a sit-down visit with them. And a lot of times they feign that they're not there, they can't be there, so they leave you to their staff. And what if you're a staff person, you're just as important to the operations as the person whose name is on the door, because if you don't do the work, they don't get the credit that they always get for it. So we know this, and we train for that, like we're telling you now. So when you're in there talking to staff, you're talking to them as if they're on level with the person that they're staffing for. So you're important to us in this. So what happened in our situation, we were talking to a staff of a Harlem legislator we're trying to get to support HALT, and who had never said they weren't against it, but never formally pitched that they were in. So when we're having this real nice discussion with them, because the legislator wasn't there, and sometimes people go in and they feel, legislator in here, and they feel bummed. But you go in with the attitude that they're important, and we're having this good conversation. And one of the staffers revealed to us that they had a family member, their brother, who was incarcerated and had did solitary time, and how they saw how it impacted them. But they had never shared this with the legislator. So being a survivor myself and having been incarcerated, I was able to talk on a level and say, well, it's something you should let them know, that this way they might be more sympathetic to issues about that, could help us out, blah, blah, blah. And as luck would have it, they ended up having the discussion, and the legislator subsequently signed on to be a co-sponsor of the HALT bill. But had we not had the discussion with the staff person, or treated them like, well, you're just a staff and no way you can possibly help me if the legislator here, we would have missed a golden opportunity to turn somebody to our side.
All right, so it starts with just learning their names. You'd be surprised how often people don't bother to learn the names of someone's staff, and then it goes on to having real relationship with them. All right, so the third leg in our stool is media. And when you think about media, you're thinking about the full range. So you're thinking newspaper, you're thinking TV, you're thinking radio, you're thinking social media. And we'll talk briefly about each. So when you think about your newspaper, there are 2 main aspects for telling your story. So there's the news side of it, and then there's the editorial side. And the editorial side, if you sort of picture your Buffalo News, the back of the first section, they're the editorials they write. There are op-ed pieces by local experts that they run. There's a My View that's sort of a personal story. And then on the other side, you've got the letters to the editor. So you want to use all those tools in your campaign, and they can all be very valuable. The one you probably are the least familiar with is how do you get the editorial board to write an editorial about your issue. So I'll ask Andrew to explain how they got a very favorable editorial on the West Seneca campaign.
So the task force decided that we wanted to get an editorial, and we reached out to the editorial page editor, who's a member of the editorial board, and we were able to get a meeting, and she was also very forthright in telling us like tips and things that we should and should not do when we go into that meeting. She was like, don't bring a bunch of people, don't bombard it, don't kind of overwhelm us with trying to like persuade us, come prepared. Basically like she was like, don't abuse our time. And I was like, okay, cool. And so we went in, and Sam joined us also, because one of the things that we tried to do to think strategically, we knew we could only bring a certain number of people, because she was really clear about bringing a small group. So we thought, okay, who needs to be included? We want to have a community partner that they're very familiar with. We want to have a parent, and we want to have people that are directly affected by the issue. And so we got a small group together that could touch on all of those aspects. And we came prepared. Like we had our fact sheets and we had information to provide to them. And we're also prepared to answer their questions, because basically what you do is you just briefly tell them what your issue is, and then they have an opportunity to ask questions. And so you want to be prepared to answer those questions as fully and completely as you can. And when you're doing a meeting with them, they're going to try to show no favor, like be really stone-faced, which can kind of be intimidating, but that's just the way that works. So anyway, we were kind of surprised a week later when they did this huge editorial that was like 100% behind the move, and they even went so far as to say, we know this is going to cost a lot of money, but it will be money well spent, because it won't cost as much as like the psychic cost on these people or the cost of isolation, which was a sticking point for them, because that was the question they kept asking, was like, well, who's going to pay for this? And we were like, well, the state of New York is going to have to pay for it, but the state of New York is also going to have to keep investing in this dilapidated campus. So you can either invest your money in a dilapidated, isolated campus, or you can invest it somewhere else. And they bought the argument, and it was like, yay, cool. So you never know; it could go another way. Like you know.
Yeah, it's not likely to backfire. You're not likely to go see an editorial board and then have them write an editorial condemning you.
Right.
The other side might go, and the other side might get them to write an editorial. So it's not like you'll guarantee to win, but you going there is always going to be good, basically.
And I would say also, like, I think another thing that worked in our favor was tying the march to the ADA anniversary and making it a newsworthy event, and making the issue a newsworthy event, and convincing them, this is something of broad concern in the community. Like, there's a lot of people affected by this, a lot of people who care, and this has historical and news relevance.
Exactly, and one thing that you all did also successfully was cultivate an individual reporter. So that's a key tool. So my overall theme with press work is it's much easier than you think, and you should not be scared to do it. And that comes with editorial board. You can call them up and ask them for a meeting. Worst thing is they'll say is no, but you'll be surprised how often they say yes. But also with reporters. Call them up and invite them to coffee. They'll often say yes. Even if you don't have a direct story to pitch to them right then, you might want to get to know that reporter and give them background on your issue. And they'll often say yes to that. They'll want to know the background for an issue. And then when the story comes up, they're ready to write about it. But then who are they going to call to find out more? They're going to call you.
Yep.
Because now they know your name and your number, and they know that you're an expert on that issue. So you're building relationships with individual reporters just by looking through the newspaper and seeing who writes about which issue and then calling that person up.
And that's what we did with Sean Kursk. We knew that he had written about developmental disability issues before in the past. So we called him up and told him we had this story. We had this architectural report that we had gotten. We had been doing this campaign. And he wound up writing a feature article the week before the editorial came out, where he interviewed people who had lived in the institution. And it was a very powerful story. And so that helped establish in the editorial board's mind, hey, this is a relevant story. And reporters are always looking for stories.
Oh, right.
And you, as an advocate, you can provide them with stories.
Yeah, they get paid to tell stories. If they don't have them to tell, they don't get paid. So and it may seem really simple, but you're like, why am I calling them up? So much happening in the world, but they need a story. They may not be catching everything else, and your story might be the one that gets them that Pulitzer or whatever they're looking for. But can I digress for 1 minute about relationships?
Yeah.
We didn't say about with the public officials. That's equal to what we should be saying about media people. Mm-hmm. No permanent enemies, only permanent issues. That, if somebody doesn't agree with you, they're not on their side, they write something against you, you can't make that person a permanent enemy because they have that voice that they can always throw at you. You want to keep it as neutral and as professional and cordial as possible, even when you agree that you can't agree. Because you never know when you might need them in the whole thing about don't burn bridges. These are the relationships that you don't want to burn bridges with because you never know when you have to cross them again. And often when you're doing advocacy work, you're going to have to cross them again. So it's better to have, the enemy of my enemy is my friend in this case.
Great. So we are running out of time. I want to give you just a few more tips on where to find some other resources. And then we'll let anyone go who needs to go. If anyone wants to stay and ask us questions, we're happy to stay for a few minutes. But I just want to let you know that on the website, in that action section, you can find tools on meeting with elected officials, but you can also find a lot on press work. So we have a media list already for you. So if you want to send out a press release, we've got advice on how to do a press release, but we also have a media list, so you don't have to make up your own media list. That's who you would send your press release to. So lots of tools there for you. Please take advantage of them, and if you need extra help, feel free to reach out to us. And just close with on the media section by reiterating, it's easier than you think. Don't be afraid to have a press conference. Don't be afraid to call reporters. Don't be afraid to submit op-eds. Those are all tools that are surprisingly easy to use. All right, so it's 7 o'clock. Let's thank our panelists, and then feel free to stay, and we'll answer any more questions you have. So, anyone needs to go. Anyone who's got questions?
I will say really quickly, I'll be following up with any of these specific materials. We do have some information that we'll be sending out about, I think, individuals, but that won't be available for about a month. And then you can become a partner. If you want to host a workshop, get in contact with us, or if you want to do any of the things that we had talked about earlier, or you can grab a paper copy of the survey here. Last thing, if you do plan on attending another one of these workshops or labs, you can leave your name tent here, and we'll collect them at the end.
All right, thank you, Kristen. So, any questions that anyone wants to ask? Yes, Emily.
I just wanted an update on both of those campaigns that you're working on.
Oh, yeah, great.
And see where you're at with both of them.
Well, we were fortunate enough in the last session to get it passed in the Assembly, but now we got to fight to get it passed in the Senate, and that's the whole thing working with Gallivan. So it's received. We're on the right track. It's been like 8 years they've been fighting this, so finally getting the traction that we had hoped to get earlier. but we still got a long way to go. The hope is that maybe after these elections that come up in November, there'll be enough people sensitive to the issue that we can win the Senate and get it passed, or that the governor will include it in his budget next year.
So it's been a long campaign and pretty kind of slow at times. But what we've seen since 2013 is we've gone from absolutely no to having some substantive conversations to having some substantial interim steps. So, for example, the OPWDD agreed to have a shuttle go from Southgate Plaza to the office so that people who actually worked there and had disabilities could get there. And then they opened up that shuttle to all employees. And then they started running that shuttle more often. And then we persuaded them that as an interim step, they should establish a satellite office that would help provide some basic services, including self-advocacy services in the community. And so they've been in talks with the Shared Space Coalition to work on that, on actually getting an office, like a drop-in office where people could get access to information and services. But what we ultimately want them to do is to move everything off of that campus. So what we're proposing at this point, and we're having regular conversations with the OPWDD commissioners and deputy commissioners, as well as with the governor's staff. And what we're trying to persuade them now is look, set up a committee or a process where people with disabilities can give actual input, and families of people with disabilities can give actual input on what is needed, what kind of office we need, so that we are included throughout in the planning process and the transition process. So you don't give us a satellite office that doesn't really do us any good. And also so that we can continue understanding that it's a multi-year process to plan for this move, because there's so many different parts. There's the regional office, there's the state office, there's the maintenance, there's the security. We need some sort of commission or forum where people can be held accountable for transitioning completely to a community-based system. And the OPWDD has what they call the transformational agenda, and it's because of federal pressure and advocacy pressure to get people with disabilities in the community. So that's always something that we're continually reminding them of, is like, federal law says you need to do this. Like, you can't continue to isolate people with disabilities. So hopefully we'll get that satellite, then we'll get a commission, and we can get some money in the state budget. And that's not going to happen this year, but we could have money in the state budget next year. We already have some money for the satellite office, and we also know that the governor's office has a big access to a big pool of money that wouldn't involve the legislator. So if we could manage to convince the governor that this needs to happen, he might be able to do it with his own funds.
He made a good point that I wish everybody was here to hear. Yes. If everybody was here to hear, that I want to just tell you, sometimes your campaign is moving along and you're not getting what you want, but the pressure that you bring to bear makes changes anyway. Because although we don't have all the things we want, now they're doing certain things in solitary that they were totally against doing, to try to say, well, we don't need that because we're doing this here. So if you sometimes you may not see your whole thing come to fruition, but you'll make changes along the way that will be positive towards what your ultimate goal was trying to reach to begin with.
Yeah, the regional director for OPWDD and his deputy, they've totally changed their position on it. Now, they don't have the power to make the changes that we would like to have made, but they've gone from this will never happen to this should happen, which is a big, that's a big deal.
Yeah. That's great. Other questions? Yeah.
So it seems like a lot of getting momentum and building a movement is with the relationships and with giving and taking and a mutually beneficial thing. What type of things can you do, or whether it be an internal structure or management style, to make sure that your message stays your message and you control where it goes and how it gets there?
You know what's tough about that? You have to be a dictator to make sure that happens like that. that's why the give and take, the compromise is always something that has to be on the table. Because if you're working with other people, it can't be my way or the highway, because then it would probably be the highway. You know what I'm saying? So I think it's not wise to want to go into it thinking that you want to get as much of what you want out of it as possible, with the understanding that you may have to give somebody else something or make some type of, minor compromise. You never should give up the integrity of what you're trying to do. To make no mistakes about that. I'd rather lock me up, and I never want to go back there, than to do that. But you have to be willing to say, all right, I see where we're going. Can we meet here in order sometimes to advance it? I'm going to tell you how that happened. We're in conversations with the governor's office, and his legal guy, Alfonso David, is telling us, well, shall is all right, but can we put will? Now, if we say shall is, then they're not going to support it. So you have to say, okay, will, but can we get this here? It's really a haggling, negotiating thing, but you got to be willing. And the smart thing is to know what you're willing to give up in the beginning, and then play to that. Say, you got me there, I'm going to give you that. But you already knew you was giving that up. So, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's excellent advice. The other one tool that I think is really useful when you're working in coalitions is that you actually have ground rules for how the coalition operates, and you have a set of principles that everyone agrees to. So a lot of coalitions, when they form, don't do this. Mm-hmm. The ones that work best often do. So they have like a voting process, for example. They have a decision-making process. They might have an executive committee, even if it's more sophisticated. So there's sort of ground rules, but then there are also certain things they'll commit to up front, as we're not going to trade this away. And then they'll have, like Jerome is saying, other lists of things that are negotiable. So if everyone goes into it in the beginning knowing what's non-negotiable, then you'll have much less chance of misunderstanding or sort of the message drifting or away from you.
A couple of things. One, just to kind of reiterate what Jerome said, is like we had this clear. We want the office to move, right? But at the same time, we know that there are immediate needs, like making sure that the people that work there can get access to it. So we're willing to say, okay, this is going to be a multi-year process. Right now, we've just had the bus cut, and workers can't get there. So we got to get some kind of shuttle. So if we can get some transportation solution, that's one victory. But then we keep pushing. We need a little more, and we keep pushing, knowing that it's going to be sometimes you have to. So the point is, sometimes you have to have a multi-step strategy. That's short term, middle term, long term. And then also, I think one of the things that's been helpful for the task force is that we started out as just a group of people, but then we collaborated with Voice Buffalo, which was a professional community organizing group, and they had experience and connections and ground rules, like Sam was talking about, that really helped us clarify things. And we always stuck to this idea that the whole thing needs to move, even when we were prepared to make compromises or do a satellite office or whatever. We never changed that, the whole idea that the service should be community-based was the driving thing, and that was always the message that was consistent throughout.
All right. One last question from anyone before we go?
Yeah, I think this kind of goes to both of you. You spoke about evolving messages, and Mr. Wright was mentioning getting it through the Assembly, but not yet the Senate. I'm sorry, evolving, not message, evolving strategy. So when something like that happens, when you have a victory in the Assembly and then not yet in the Senate, I guess this is a function of resources, how much resources the organization has, but are you, saying, okay, maybe we have an opportunity to get through the Senate in the next election cycle? Are you proactively going out and trying to get your message across to candidates that may land in those power positions? Are you looking at is there information available for your organization to say, okay, I think this guy's got a higher chance of winning than this guy. We should be spending time talking.
See, if you was on our conference call the other day, you'd have never asked that. You'd never asked that question because no, what we do exactly that. You know, in the city they had some IDC members. This is a group that splintered off, and all of them lost. So what we had prepared to do is talk to all the people who were running against them in the primaries to begin with, to see where they stood. So now we already had a relationship with them. Now if they win the general election, we've already kind of figured out where they're landing and what we need to do to move them over. A win in the assembly was big, especially because of the numbers, but you don't get to pass until you get it through both houses. It's like, you know, you win the regular season, now we're in the playoffs, and you know, you're playing for the ring. If you don't get the championship, you feel like, you know, it was a good season, but we didn't. So we in that now, that next area where I'm concentrating only on the people now who are against us or who haven't voted. So all the Senate Republicans will be seeing me for the next 6 months like their dreams. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.